is the Commission and Council proposal regarding an EU-wide ban on Nazist and fascist symbols and slogans. The Minister, Mr. Maasikas, will start with a statement on behalf of the Council. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. President, honourable members, Commissioner, you have invited the Presidency to speak on behalf of the Council on the topic of an EU-wide ban on Nazi and fascist symbols and slogans. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here and to present our views on this topic. This discussion is important for several reasons. First of all, reports from the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, the Council of Europe, and the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe confirm an alarming increase of intolerance and hatred in Europe. There might be several reasons explaining this worrying phenomenon, but let me be clear on this: there is no justification for it. Secondly, we notice an increasing use of Nazi and fascist symbols on social media platforms, but also in public, both online and offline. This shows that some of our citizens have not learned from history. As we know, this can be very dangerous. Those who forget mistakes of their own history risk repeating them. We are therefore obliged to take all incidents of that kind seriously and never ignore them. On a positive note, the EU has adopted specific legislation on combating intolerance and hatred. I refer in particular to the 2008 Framework Decision on Combating Racism and Xenophobia. In June 2016, the Council invited Member States to ensure the effective transposition and implementation of the Framework Decision and other relevant hate crime laws at national level. In addition, it asked Member States to develop effective methods to report and ensure proper recording of hate crimes. According to this legislation, specific offences exist when directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group, defined by reference to race, colour, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin. They include, among others, public incitement to violence or hatred, public dissemination or distribution of propaganda material and images. I have already mentioned that social media is one of the main vehicles enabling hate speech to go viral. One possible remedy against this epidemic is a harmonised and determined European response. As for the steps taken in the Council, the Estonian Presidency and the previous Maltese and Slovak presidencies have done important work to tackle these issues. In October, the Council conclusions on the application of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in 2016 were adopted, where the Council welcomes the measures coordinated by the Commission High-Level Group on combating racism, xenophobia and other forms of intolerance. We also welcome and support the ongoing EU-level dialogue with major IT companies to address hate speech online, also through the implementation of the Code of Conduct launched by the Commission to this purpose. Last but not least, we should remember and commend the remarkable work done by the Fundamental Rights Agency in this field. But all these countermeasures would be in vain if we forget the important role of education and youth work, and, more precisely, the need to develop democratic resilience, media literacy, tolerance, critical thinking, and conflict resolution skills in the learning process. To sum up, we have different tools. We have knowledge, education, counter-narratives, but also condemnation of any form of anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim violence, hate speech or discrimination. Accordingly, the responsibility rests with all of us: politicians, teachers, civil servants, students, parents, and if needed also judges and prosecutors. No one can close their eyes or ears and pretend not to see injustice, discrimination or hatred. I would like to conclude by stressing how important it is to prevent our societies from becoming dominated by hatred. Our role and on this I know I can count on your support, is to remind ourselves of our responsibility for what we say. Words and symbols have power, including the power to harm. For this reason, freedom of expression has its limits. It is our common responsibility to find the right balance, and this is never an easy task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I now give the floor to Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos on behalf of the Commission. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, we all know, and we are proud of it, that the European Union is built upon common values of human dignity, fundamental rights, equality, rule of law and democracy. The European Commission shares the concerns of the Parliament over worrying trends in the rise of racist and xenophobic attitudes, which sadly found their way into the mainstream politics and mainstream media. Under the framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia by means of criminal law, the Member States must ensure that public incitement to violence or hatred, including through the use of Nazi and fascist symbols and slogans, is criminalised under national law. National law enforcement and judicial authorities are responsible to investigate and prosecute any such instance. The Commission rigorously monitors the application of this legislation. In the past couple of years, 9 Member States made amendments to their respective criminal laws in order to bring them in line. The Commission will continue to work on reducing remaining gaps in national legislation. But laws are only as good as they are effectively implemented in practice. This is why the Commission has been stepping up its efforts to assist Member States to build the capacity to ensure the effective implementation of the law, but also to support targeted measures to prevent and tackle intolerance in practice. These include the work of the EU High-Level Group on combating racism, xenophobia and other forms of intolerance. The EU High-Level Group was set up in 2016 to foster discussions and synergies between Member States, civil society and other key stakeholders with a view to improving responses, including guidance on how to train police and judicial authorities on hate speech and hate crime, or guidance on how to ensure adequate support and protection to hate crime victims. The Commission has been leading major initiatives such as the Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. The recent guidance communication on tackling illegal content online, adopted by the Commission in September, is also providing key impetus to further progress in this area. Continued efforts are also devoted to initiatives on remembrance. As the Commission marked in its statement on the Europe-wide Day of Remembrance for the victims of all totalitarian and authoritarian regimes on 23rd of August, it is essential not only to remember the victims of these regimes, but also to use remembrance as a guide for the future so as not to repeat mistakes and let discrimination and hate speech again. I used to say that history does not really repeat itself. Men repeat history very simply because they don't read it and they don't draw lessons and what has happened in the past. This is why the Commission strongly reaffirmed on that occasion the rejection of totalitarian and authoritarian ideologies such as Nazism and fascism. It is crucial to remember past horrors in order to give us the knowledge and strength to reject those who seek to revive these heinous ideologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I now give the floor to the political groups, starting with the European People's Party. Mrs. Dubravka ŠUICA, 1 minute 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I would like first to thank the Commission and the Council for their engagement in the fight against all totalitarian systems and symbols. I thank you also for putting this point on the agenda of the European Parliament. But for us in Croatia, as opposed to the Western world, the situation is different because we have clear memories of a recent regime which was not totalitarian, but it was a communist regime which caused many deaths, and their totalitarian symbols and slogans are equally unacceptable in the Europe of 21st century. Therefore, I'm really sorry that in the topic of this agenda you have not included communism. Of course, I'm against all totalitarian symbols and slogans. Let me try to explain the situation in Croatia now. In the public space there are various interpretations of history, and there is no systematic culture of memory of breaching human rights in such regimes. Therefore, the current government, headed by Mr. Plenković, have founded a council for confrontation with the past and to propose to the government recommendations for such contents. Europe and Croatia have to equally distance themselves from all the regimes that discriminated on any basis, for any persecution, for any mass murder, or countering any basic freedoms. I welcome putting this topic on the agenda, and I also am happy that the Commission and the Council have presented the position of the Commission, which is against any totalitarianism.
Thank you very much indeed. For the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Mrs. KYENGE, 2 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente. Grazie, Commissario.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner. In the 60 years since the signing of the Treaty of Rome, Europe has built a road towards peace. We've made it possible for our diversity to no longer be a source of division, but on the contrary, the very foundation of our ability to live together and our common values built over the centuries. Values such as democracy, human rights, freedom of thought, and the principle of the rule of law. We haven't been able to destroy these in history, despite the dictatorships such as fascism we've been through. This is why the European Union is now the opposite of what those examples of fascism represented. Nazi fascism is not an opinion. It's not an example of exercising the freedom of expression. It's actually the opposite. It denies and undermines freedom. It's a crime. It's a crime which corresponds to a certain time in history. As Primo Levi said, President, to every time it's fascists. They start permeate our society in all sorts of subtle ways in which they try to impose their order. The security of a privileged few is based on the forced silence of the many. Police order. Fascism starts with that. They start reinstating language which is designed to provoke deep divisions in society, promoting the idea that we should be suppressing democracy, criminalizing diversity. So, President, we can never consider such acts to be a simple expression of the freedom of expression. We are free to express our thoughts and opinions, thanks, amongst other things, to the fact that we destroyed Nazism, which has always been an expression of violence. So we shouldn't allow that just to be relegated to folklore in the distant past. We should all have a clear and solid memory of the past so as to look forward safely to the future. We should never forget the past. We should ban and sideline Nazism. It's those who apologize for it, destroy its museums and its symbols. That's not denying the freedom which must be open to all of us. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Mr. HALLA-AHO for the European Conservatives and Reformists Group. 1 minute.
I think it is very childish to try and ban symbols, even if they represent repulsive ideologies such as National Socialism or communism for that matter. First, it is difficult to define what exactly is banned and in what contexts. Symbols such as the swastika or the red star are universal motifs and have different meanings in different cultures. It is even more difficult to define expressions. Second, we would never reach an agreement on which destructive ideologies are bad enough for their symbols to be banned. The criteria would be political, not objective. Third, if you ban a symbol representing a certain ideology, the proponents of that ideology will just invent a new symbol, which resembles the old one just enough to be understood, but not enough to meet the definition. I must say I disagree with Mr. Maasikas. Symbols alone have no power, they are ink on paper. Thank you.
Colleague, there is a blue card for you. Would you like to accept it from Mrs. Grapini?
Yeah.
Prego, onorevole Grapini.
Mrs. Grapini, you have the floor.
Dear colleague, you said that it is childish to ban certain symbols. Indeed, we are not speaking here of certain symbols, but we specify the symbols. Do you believe that Nazi, fascist symbols that have been demonstrated by specialists can influence children and the youth in being extremists and fomenting gestures of violence? Do you think that such symbols can bear an influence on children?
I don't believe extremism stems from symbols of extremism. What I wanted to point out is it would be very difficult to make a definition which would ban the Nazi swastika, but not the swastika in other contexts, used in different cultures, in different times and places.
Grazie, collega. Volevo
Thank you. For a colleague who asked for another blue card. It's just one blue card per speaker, so we have to keep to that rule. So let's continue with the debate for the ALDE group. Mr. JAKOVČIĆ, 2 minutes.
The Parliament has put this topic on the agenda, but I am now looking at the streets of European citizens, and we can see there are so many people demonstrating publicly symbols of totalitarian regimes. We have seen what happens in Warsaw, Rome, Zagreb, and in other cities as well. There's such a long series of hate manifestations around us to keep silence. Nazism comes from Germany, but Germany was the first one to decide to punish all those who use slogans or symbols of Nazism. Italy has done so in respect of fascism in a similar way. But unfortunately, there are still countries and governments in the EU who treat symbols or such symbols without sanctions or firm reactions. The European Union was founded with a wish to avoid war forever in Europe. The evil of Nazism, which was born on European soil and spread, was defeated but not eradicated. Therefore, we need to act immediately and now and here. And because of this, not only Member States but also the EU, this Parliament, the Commission, have to propose concrete legislative proposals at a European level. I call on the Commission and on all of us in the Parliament, within this mandate of the Parliament, to adopt a resolution and all other necessary legal acts countering all those who use symbols and slogans of defeated regimes. Totalitarian regimes.
Adesso per il gruppo confederale della sinistra.
Thank you. Now for the KYENGE, Mr. KOULOGLOU, for 1 minute.
Είναι θετικό το γεγονός ότι πάμε για να...
It's positive, the fact that we are preparing to to ban Nazi and fascist symbols. But we must consider why in Europe of today the extreme right and fascist tendencies are reappearing. We've seen it in Greece, but also in Germany and in other countries of the EU. In order to tackle this political phenomenon, we must tackle the causes behind it. That means this comes down to the austerity policy and the injustices in society. That leads to annoyance in the populace and insecurity. It also means that many employees, many simple people, have been caught up by the right. We must have a different policy. We need a social and just Europe which makes sure that we have stability and security for citizens.
Kouloglou, c'è una blue card da parte.
There's a blue card from Ms. Štětina. Do you accept it?
Blue card for you. Would you like to accept it? Yes. Prego, onorevole Štětina.
Štětina, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleague, I welcome the efforts of the Commission and Council to ban Nazi symbols and slogans. And let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a hooked cross and a hammer and sickle? What is the difference between a Nazi totalitarianism and communist totalitarianism? Because communists has killed many people as well. Isn't it time to include communist symbols in the ban?
The difference between Nazi symbols, National Socialist symbols, and communist symbols, you can see that via a photograph. The photograph of the liberation of Berlin from the fascist military. And these were steps where millions of people were destroyed in death camps, and the liberation of Berlin from Hitler, and a flag reflects that, and you can't confuse the one with the other.
Grazie, onorevole Kouloglou.
Thank you, Mr. Kouloglou. I can't see Mr. Rope from the Greens European Free Alliance, so I'll now give the floor to Udo VOIGT. 1 minute, non-attached members.
Werte Kollegen.
So, dear colleagues, a strong democracy has to accept symbols and flags from the past. If a democracy bans this symbol, it shows it's weak and cannot rely on its power to convince. If the 6 million claim that the 60 million call on memory, we need to have the same provisions for all, whatever their beliefs. With bans, you're creating new totalitarianism. You keep talking about the values of the European Union. Often these are anti-family, anti the fatherland, anti-normal relations between the sexes, and now it's anti-freedom of conscience and freedom of thought. You can only have a freedom of thought completely or not at all. Thank you very much, Mr. VOIGT. Now, Mrs. THUN and Hohenstein, 1 minute 30 seconds.
Przewodniczący, nie możemy udawać, że nie.
Thank you, President. We cannot pretend that we are turning a blind eye to things happening in our member states. We can't show any tolerance of fascist attitudes. Today we are celebrating the anniversary of the imposition of martial law in Poland. Today the Polish Parliament is surrounded by barriers guarded by the police so as to ensure that citizens cannot demonstrate freely and peacefully in front of the Parliament. The same police protects demonstrations in which fascist symbols are delayed. Pure blood for Europe or Europe for whites, for example. This symbol I'm showing you now reminds us of anti-Semitism from the 1930s, where the same group, OMR, that I'm referring to, used this symbol back in the 1930s as part of its discrimination against Jewish colleagues at in universities, organizing ghettos for Jews at the back corner of the rooms. During the recent ONR demonstrations, the police protected the demonstrators. I would call for measures leading to the outlawing of fascist organizations. We need to establish a ban at the European level of fascist and Nazi symbols.
Thank you very much. Please stick to time. Neena Gill, you have the floor for 1 minute 30 seconds.
This is a timely debate given across the EU we've seen a resurgence of Nazi and fascist symbols. As the memory declines about how under these symbols and slogans millions of people were killed in Europe. The ideology underlying these symbols is hatred of democracy and the idea that force is legitimate means to achieve power, encouraging conflict in our society. This stands in a stark contrast to the values of the European Union. Yet how easily do we tolerate fascists in this House? They can comfortably use the funds of an organisation whose destruction they seek and values that they sneer at. Now, in my country and in my region, in West Midlands, hate crimes have spiked as a result of the referendum, the Brexit referendum. They've increased by a shocking 30%. It's become a norm now across the EU to kind of attack migrants and the places of their worship. Yet it still remains not very well reported, and only 1 in 5 people actually report the incidents or get any conviction. Now, I don't believe, President, that we can win this fight by just banning Nazi or fascist symbols, important though that is. We also need to really work at changing the mindsets, having a more integrationist policies. And this is not just confined to the member states. It's also important that we really set an example here. If you look around this House, there are very few people who are symbols of diversity. I think it is important, if we're going to change that mindset, President, that we try and address that within the EU institutions. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Jurek. 1 minute.
President, colleagues, in this plenary chamber, I've said this already, and I'm saying it to you. The communist power brokers in the past hid thousands of people behind curtains. And were arrested by the communist police. But this isn't the point. We should talk about Bolshevism and communism. These are also totalitarian regimes, but that isn't the point today. Why am I saying that? I called on the Commission to define very clearly what are extremist things. There was a case in Paris a month ago. A former Prime Minister was present. A cross was defamated where there was a victim of the NKVD. If we have an extremist proper debate, such extremist cases should be tackled. It wasn't. This was a case where a former French Prime Minister and the Mayor of Paris were present. We shouldn't admit things like this.
Thank you. There are two blue cards. The first one from KORWIN-MIKKE. Do you accept that? Do you accept the blue card?
First, don't you think that Nazi is a symbol exactly like swastika, so it should also be forbidden? You should name National Socialism, as socialism is a sense of the Hitlerist doctrine, and as Stalin, Hitler and Mao Zedong and others killed 10 times more people than Adolf Hitler, then red flag, hammered sickle and red star should be also forbidden if swastika is forbidden. And moreover, don't you think that forbidden fruit is very attractive? And moreover, I think that European Union should be destroyed. Thank you very much.
Panie pośle, skupiłem się na tej ponurej manifestacji w Paryżu.
So, I talked about this terrible demonstration in Paris. As I say, a former Prime Minister was present, but also the Mayor of Paris. So it can't be the case, it's absurd, that a month ago, here, we see posters in the European Parliament with hammers and sickles. It's the communist equivalent of the swastika. Or we should look at Che Guevara. He was the henchman of the Cuban Revolution. That can't be the case. Isn't normal. It shows that this debate isn't honest that we're having here. As I say, I was talking about this terrible demonstration in Paris a month ago.
La parola all'onorevole VAJGL.
I now give the floor to Mr. VAJGL, 1.5 minutes.
Ja se bom vrnil.
I will go back to the title of this discussion today. There are countries where the display of Nazi, fascist, anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic and other extremist symbols doesn't surprise us anymore. So what has happened? Why do we have to debate these things in the European Parliament? One of the leading politicians of the German AfD, Björn Höcke, called the Holocaust Memorial the monument of shame. The neo-Nazist organization White Rex in Russia is building a network of neo-Nazist ideology under the cover of making business. In Italy, a few days ago, a group of masked members of the fascist Forza Nuova declared war against La Repubblica and L'Espresso. The American President Trump retweeted messages of British neo-Nazis and justified neo-Nazist demonstration in Charlottesville. Serbs and Croats proclaimed as heroes war criminals convicted in The Hague. One of them, Vojislav Šešelj, is sitting in the Serbian parliament, while the Croatian extremists are erecting a monument to the fascist state of NDH in the concentration camp of Jasenovac. The Hungarian neo-Nazis seem to be an untouchable part of the political landscape. The same goes for Ukraine. The phenomenon of extremist right used to be known in the European East, in the post-communist transition countries, but today we can find it in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Greece and Spain. Iconography may be new or old, but the message is the same and is dangerous if we don't grasp it on time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. VAJGL. A blue card from Mr. TOLIĆ. Do you accept it?
Prego.
Please go ahead, Mr. TOLIČ.
Poštovani kolega.
Colleague, why did you say that Croatia is setting up a monument to independent Croatian state, NDH? This was a monument to regular forces of the independence war, nothing to do with neo-Nazi regime.
Gospodine kolega, I znam dobro kakav je spomenik bio postavljen u Jasenovacu I na sreću I zahvaljujući pameti nekih odgovornih ljudi I uklonjen. Prema tome ne trebamo da igramo male igre tu oko toga. Hvala lijepo.
Mi dicono che c'era un problema con
There was a problem with the interpretation. Mr. Weigl, could you repeat what you said?
In polacco.
Polish is fine.
Se vuole ripetere.
Perhaps you could repeat what you were saying.
Bene, altrimenti procediamo adesso.
Otherwise we'll proceed, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Forenza for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Congratulations. Italy, my own country, has one of the most beautiful constitutions in the world, a constitution whose roots go back to the fight against fascism, signed by Umberto Giardini, a communist. In Italy, the reconstitution of the fascist party is specifically banned by the constitution, and in recent weeks we've seen threats to this, such as attacks by skinheads against groups of immigrants, the resurgence of the Casa Pound, and the strength of the fascist vote in a Roman suburb, Ostia. We've always said that fascism is still a topical issue. We know that some people still use anti-fascism as an ideological tool. How anti-fascism is still something which is topical and important for our times. The majority of European governments, most of which are neoliberal in nature, haven't realized the threat of a growing new form of neo-Nazism. We've seen what's been happening in the Ukraine government, Poroshenko. We've also know about his links with organized crime. I'm winding up. The shameful links between communism and fascism. The Red Army helped free Europe from Nazi fascism. And once again, we've seen the camps in Libya which will remind us of fascism.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Forenza. Thank you for your kind words, but we must stick to time. Let me remind you. Mr. Solé, Jordi, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. In the Spanish state, there are 135 monuments honoring the dictator Franco, including his tomb in the Valley of the Fallen, and 750,000 euros go every year to maintaining these. And over the last 3 months in Catalonia, there have been dozens of actions of far-right groups, Spanish groups, which go unpunished, and they've been using fascist symbols. We're seeing a worrying spike in such activities. The Spanish government, like other EU governments, has no interest in banning the exaltation of fascist ideology, and hence determined action at EU level would be welcomed. And I don't think it would be a way of ending hatred once and for all, but it would be a step forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Solé. I'll give the floor now to Mrs. Šojdrová for 1 minute 30 seconds.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. President. We are speaking about this topic because in Europe we see this very concerning rise of fascist ideology and Nazi symbols. Yes, symbols are visible. However, we have to fight against hate ideology, especially if the ideology is still alive. What is really important is education and media, because the young people have no personal experience of these horrible ideology and of the horrors which it caused in the 20th century. That's why we have to educate them, and we have to give them this direct experience of people who still remember it. That's why I really appreciate the activity of the Memory of the Nation, which is a very important organization in the Czech Republic, and other important organizations in Europe. It is very important to share this experience, to communicate this experience in the whole Europe and also in social platforms. And we should assist member states in combating these hate speech, and we should give them sufficient funding, and also we should create such legislation which would enable us to do it. We should speak more about this experience with Nazi and communist regimes. And it is no coincidence that many victims of Nazis were suffering in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And perhaps in this regard we should think about communist symbols as well, because sickle and hammer are symbols of the ideology which killed more than 50 million people. It is something we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Schlein for 1.5 minutes. Go ahead, Ellie. Thank you, President. Recently, we've seen a dangerous resurge of fascism, a very worrying escalation of a series of episodes which we can't underestimate. We're not just talking about isolated incidents carried out by youngsters, which some people seem to be suggesting here. In Italy, in just a few days, we've been very frightening events. In Como, for example, a group of skinheads who burst into a meeting of people helping refugees. In Rome, we saw a fascist attack on the national headquarters of the Republican newspaper, and in Bologna, the anti-fascist organization saw an arson attack. So we've heard about waves of hate and xenophobia throughout Europe. It's becoming very worrying and requires firm action on the part of the European Union. The same applies to social media. The European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights should apply to all social media wherever they're located. Apology of fascism is a crime in our country, but not on Facebook. We should be blocking pages inciting to hate and encouraging fascism. There are more than 300 such pages in Italy, according to the National Partisan Network. So this is a follow-on from the tragedies of world wars and the horror of Nazi and fascist ideology. We have to act. Not just institutions, parties, associations, but all citizens, all of us should mobilize. We're talking here about the very future of democracy, a future which we want to hand on to our children. I say this every time I hear fascist ideology. Thank you, Ms. Schlein. The next speaker is Ms. Tom.
Thank you, President. Nazi and fascist symbols are not welcome in public space, and we have to do everything in our power to help citizens become fully aware of atrocities represented by this ideology and to help them to renounce its heritage. The same goes for the communist heritage, which is unfortunately still often celebrated and promoted even in this House. However, in order to be able to successfully demonstrate all the advantages of democracy to our citizens, we have to believe in it ourselves. The EU has over the past 20 years frequently demonstrated that it recognizes democratic processes only when it likes the outcome. The attempts to introduce changes from the European level that have not passed through national parliaments is also bypassing of democracy. Despite noble intentions, it is dangerous to send the citizens the message that it is in order to bypass procedure and impose one's will without democratic legitimacy. This, believe it or not, is the first step towards new totalitarianism. And Commissioner, fascism has killed 17 million people and communism 90. And really, I do believe that omitting to include communism is...
Thank you, Madam. Our next speaker is Mr. SCHIRDEWAN for 1 minute.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much, President.
Ich habe mit sehr viel Interesse Ihren Ausführungen zum...
I've listened with interest to your remarks on a Europe-wide ban on Nazi and fascist symbols and slogans. I would like to call on the Commission and Council and the Parliament to continue this discussion. This is a practice which is being applied in Germany now. I'd like to say, for us, the political debate on neo-Nazism and fascism is more important than just mere symbols. This policy must be one of social justice and solidarity and equality. That is in contrast to the austerity policies of recent years, through which inequalities have increased in societies and have strengthened the fascist movement. In Parliament, there are far too many representatives of right-wing, populist and fascist parties. We've witnessed that during this debate. Unfortunately, Europe doesn't need Nazi symbols or Nazi slogans, not even less does it need Nazis. Their policies are not part of this parliament, and fascism isn't an opinion, it is rather a crime.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Mr. Becker. Go ahead, Heinz.
Danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Council Representative. On behalf of the EPP, I would say that across Europe and in all 28 member states, the ban on we've seen a ban on hate speech needs to be imposed without exception. It has nothing to do with freedom of expression. As chair of the Parliamentary Working Group Against Anti-Semitism, with many convinced members of this House, we need to combat fascism, and the governments of all member states are called upon now to bring this ban into their national legislation. And and the same for hate speech and anti-Semitism on the internet. We need to make sure that we use media law in order to take action against internet platforms. Thank you to Mr. Jakovčić for the initiative for a resolution. We need to do away with Nazi and fascist symbols. We need to remove them from our European society.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. I have 2 blue cards. Would you accept the first, Mr. Jakovčić? Do you accept it? Go ahead, Mr. Jakovčić.
Micro.
Thank you very much for accepting my blue card. I have very carefully listened to what you have said. Would you agree with me that except in member states, in addition to them, the EU, the Parliament, the whole EU has to adopt a legislative framework for banning fascist symbols and slogans? Not just the member states, but the EU level also has to produce such legislation. Would you agree with this?
Yes, I fully agree with you. I think that is the only appropriate way forward. I am glad to see the unanimity shown by Council and Commission today. I would ask the 2 institutions to do the necessary now. There are examples, Germany, France and my home country, Austria, make these crimes prosecutable under the law, so please go ahead with action now.
The next speaker is Mr. HADJIGEORGIOU for 1 minute.
Όσες διαφορές ιδεολογικές και άλλες και αν έχουμε μεταξύ μας αυτή την αίθουσα.
There are different opinions on different ideologies, and as we interpret history differently, I think we can agree on one point. And this was been signed up to by all peoples in 1995. And National Socialism wanted to divide people up into different races. And that's a view which is against democracy and which we must combat. It is an ideological view which made concentration camps possible. And it isn't just history, the history of these symbols, which should be seen as a crime, but all those who continue to use these symbols. The National Socialist and fascist symbols have no place in our modern world. Only in museums should they be on display. And they have also always led to bloodshed. And European member states should fight for democracy, human rights. Symbols of this type must be dispatched to where they belong.
Thank you. For the Catch the Eye procedure, I have 4 requests. I'll be able to accept all of them. First of all, Mr. TOLIĆ for 1 minute. Go ahead.
Thank you, President. This discussion on ban on Nazi and fascist symbols and slogans all over the EU seems a bit out of place on this day. We know that these regimes were defeated in a military way and also tried in processes and declarations at national levels also banned. The slogans of Nazism and fascism have been defeated, but the rest of Europe did not live to see freedom. They lived under the communist regime for another 45 years. We have many topics such as on our agenda, social, political, youth, migrants, and all the other topics. But now we take our time to talk about banning the symbols. This is counterproductive, as if inciting people to do something that they otherwise wouldn't. This is counterproductive because banning and repression have never led to solutions, but have just caused a revolt by young people who think that such discussions are not among priorities of the EU.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Ari Rotondo. Come on, go ahead.
La preocupación que está mostrando.
I would like to share the concern we've heard in the House this evening regarding the reappearance of fascism and its symbols. I'm quite struck by the fact, however, that nobody seems to have pointed out the majority of forms of expression used by Nazism tended to extol the virtues of the fatherland rather than necessarily xenophobia. Obviously, we have to fight this subculture, this human subculture. As the Maltese minister said quite rightly, we have to do this by maintaining vigilance in society. We have to ensure that we promote a general culture which leads us to fight against this subculture, to try to isolate this human temptation, and to try to make that clear in values of citizenship, in our teaching of history, while at the same time punishing behaviour which goes against those rules, including criminal sanctions. I think we should do all of that, and I very much support the idea that we take the battle to the fascists. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Marias.
Thank you, President, and I'd like to wish you all the best in your new role. As you said, Mr. Avramopoulos, we need to recall the crimes of Nazism, the gas chambers, and we should also remember all those executed by the forces of occupation in Greece from 41 to 44. We need to avenge the victims and compensate their families. Reparations need to be paid, and loans need to be repaid, but the EPP, S&D and Liberals have been rejecting my proposal for years. We've had those requests for a hearing, and in my report references to reparations have been removed, and reference to compensation for the resistance has not been included.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Epitidios for 1 minute. Go ahead, Georgios.
Thank you, President. For decades, communists have said that every patriot fighting for his fatherland, a fascist, those fighting for the future. Today there's a call that Nazi and fascist symbols be banned. Of course, the same is not being called for communist symbols. We are neither National Socialists nor fascists. Neither I nor my colleagues who are members of the party that I represent. We are against genocide, which took place in which is taking place in Greece because of the memorandum for Greece. But now our freedom of opinion is being limited and our political activity is being restricted. Today, there's a call that these freedoms should be combated. Tomorrow. We might go further, and we might not even be able to say good morning to each other. And I think politically in Europe, murders are being put to one side, and Hemingway has something to say about this.
Thank you. That brings the Catch the Eye section to an end. I'd like to hand back to the Commissioner, Mr. Avramopoulos, on behalf of the Commission. Go ahead.
Dear colleagues, thank you for this unfortunately still very topical debate. We have recently celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaty. 60 years of a union of peace and prosperity, built on the ruins and the ashes of war and division. 60 years of democracy and freedom. We would, however, be mistaken to take for granted that the divisions, the xenophobia, the nationalism, the populism of 60 years ago are entirely gone. Our debate today shows that we continue to fight them every day, and that the ghosts of the past are still lingering. In 21st century Europe, there should be no place for fascism, for racism, for anti-Semitism, for any type of exclusion or discrimination, for any sort of totalitarian regime. We have the laws at European and national level to protect our fundamental rights. But we must also practice the spirit of this law in our everyday language and actions. To defeat xenophobia, racism and discrimination, it takes not only legislation. It is not about laws. It's about ethos and justice. Democratic Europe stands for these principles and does not forget. It also takes leadership, responsibility, democratic duty, citizens' vigilance. Honourable members, I count on you to carry the words and intentions of our debate today further in your actions and interventions here and in your countries. Our fight is not over. Stay vigilant. The threat is still there. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Over to you, Minister, on behalf of the Council.
Thank you, Mr. President, honourable members, Commissioner. Let me assure you once again that the Estonian Presidency and, of course, the Council as a whole reject all forms of racism, xenophobia, intolerance and extreme nationalism. We have a legal framework in place which needs to be effectively implemented in practice, but we need to support the laws with targeted measures to prevent and tackle intolerance such as education, public debate and counter-narratives. Honourable Member Halla-AHO disagreed with me, saying that the symbols are just ink on paper and are not dangerous as such. It just happens to be so that those nations who have experienced more direct impact of totalitarian regimes tend to be more inclined to banning these symbols. I think they know better. The Council will continue to follow this issue very closely, and I can assure that I paid particular attention to the views expressed here today during this debate. Thank you very much.
Grazie Ministro, thank you very much. Chiudo la discussione.
That brings the debate to an end. The next item on the agenda is an oral question to the Commission regarding the European Parliament's right of inquiry, the Constitutional Affairs Committee. Our colleague Harigi Atondo has the floor now for 7 minutes.